it seems that we have some new Space Marine rules out, so let's take a look at the rules for Index Wolfspear, the Space Wolf successor chapter that have got a ton of new options from the new White Dwarf. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're taking a look at the new index that's been published in White Dwarf, with some fun new rules for a different way to play Space Marines, representing the Space Wolf's Wolfspear successor chapter. White Dwarf does seem to do these new Space Marine rules at least semi-regularly, exploring the background and making some formal rules for some more well-known successor chapters, ones that maybe aren't likely to make it into the main codex just as they're a little bit niche. They've done similar ones for chapters like the Emperor's Spears and the Silver Templars, and now it seems to be the time of some Wolfie boys. I do quite like that they do these. Generally it's designed that these rules maybe aren't the absolute top tier wombo combos that you're likely to see fielded in tournaments, which is probably for the best really if you can't buy them in individual books, but they add a bit more flavour, some really quite fun combos, and expand the 40k galaxy just a little bit. I must admit it would be quite nice if they did a few other things other than just Space Marines. I'm sure they could delve into some slightly lesser known guard regiments, orc clans or Eldar craft worlds. The one time that they ventured out of the Space Marine only format was to do that fairly disappointing index for them that was literally just a reprint of previous rules. In any case, let's take a quick look at the background of the Wolfspear chapter, then go over their chapter tactic, relics, warlord trait and stratagems, and talk about how they might fit in a Space Wolves army. So the Wolfspear are one of very few Space Wolf successor chapters, one of the new Indomitus era ones that are an entire chapter of Primaris Space Marines. There really aren't all that many other Space Wolf successor chapters. They always tended to operate a bit differently with their great companies, and the few successor chapters that they have had haven't always had the best history. In any case, these seem to have been created by Rabute Gilliman alongside all of the rest of the Primaris successors, and they spent a fair bit of time on Fenris getting acquainted with Space Wolf customs and their genetic forefathers. They've wholeheartedly adopted the customs of Fenris before being deployed to be guardians of the warp anomaly known as the Pit of Raukos, and have recently seen some engagement against High Fleet Leviathan. Like near any successor chapter, they do have their own quirks. They're perhaps unusually stealthy for Space Wolves, really embodying the spirit of pack hunting, surrounding them and severing enemy supply lines, encircling them and then closing in for the kill en masse. They make great use of Phobos armor, including infiltrators and incursors. Rules-wise, they are a Space Wolf successor, so they'll get the Savage Fury combat doctrine for exploding sixes to hit in the Assault doctrine, and they gain access to most of the options within the Space Wolf Codex, the only exceptions being no special characters, only one of the higher tier type relics, and their Blood Claws don't get the Berserk Charge special rule, as they need to have Hunters Unleashed to access that. I don't believe there's any actual formal rules to say that you can't use any non-Primaris models in the army, though I guess if you were fitting with the fluff, it would be an entirely Primaris force. Their chapter tactic is called Dark Terror, and it's basically a standard combination of successor chapter tactics that you can take from the main Space Marine rulebook. You get +1 to your advance and charge rolls, essentially the Hungry for Battle trait, combined with light cover if you happen to be shot from greater than 18 inches away, essentially the stealthy trait from the main rulebook. Being Space Wolf successors isn't really a terribly bad thing. In competitive games, Space Wolves are quite frequently fielded as successors, just because one half of their chapter tactic, the heroic intervention bit, is kind of a little bit redundant, as they already have a stratagem to allow them to heroic intervene when needed up to 6 inches. It means that you still have the option to do that even if you're a successor. I would argue that both half of their traits are quite good ones. Delivering wolves into combat a bit easier is nice, and light cover will add up to a little bit more survivability, but in general it doesn't tend to be the combination that people would usually go for. A lot of people tend to use the Whirlwind of Rage and Born Heroes trait for just some absolutely enormous melee damage. Still though, a little bit more survivability at range and a bit easier charges isn't a bad thing. Really though, the main attraction to actually play these in game will be their unique Warlord traits, stratagems and relics that they get, which of course other chapters can't access. Their Warlord traits are perhaps of particular interest as they're not sagas, which I think is perhaps just a little bit limiting for the Space Wolves roster. Perhaps Saga of the Hunter is one of my favourites. In any case, the first one's quite a nice fighty one. It allows the Warlord to reroll hits in melee, and their melee attacks are better by an AP-1. That's a pretty excellent trait for a Smash character, to be honest. Could be really quite nice for a Thunderhammer for 4 rerolling hits when you're only hitting on 3s, and getting it up to AP-3 as well. I also think it will combine quite nicely with a pair of Frost Claws as well. Having them on AP-3 all the time and getting extra hits means that you're really going to have a nice blender character. Otherwise, there's one for the Warlord's ranged attacks to both hit and wound on 2+, provided the target that you're firing at isn't a vehicle or a monster. I guess in theory it could be handy in combination maybe with a Tech Marine's Forge Bolter, though he will normally hit on 2s anyway, or perhaps one of the shooty relics such as the Bellicose Bolt Rifle. though to be honest I think this might be a bit underwhelming compared with buffing the Space Wolf's powerful melee. Finally, there's a slightly unreliable combat buff that's +2 to your attacks characteristic whenever you're in engagement range of any enemy models with a leadership 7 or less. I think maybe that one could be most helpful on something like the Lieutenant and Reaver armor, which is quite notable in the Wolfspear because of the excellent relic that he can get, as he's usually going to have that Terror Troops aura, which should reduce their leadership down so you're almost always hitting with those 2 extra attacks. Out of these, I'd say the first and the third ones are probably my favourite. They'd be competing against the usual suspects such as Rights as War for Obsec, Saga of the Hunter for the advance and charge, and maybe the Imperium Sword for a flat melee boost. Moving on to relics, and first we have the Elemental Shroud, a -1 to hit the bearer, and if you're stationary you can't be shot from greater than 18 inches away. I guess that second part could be kind of handy to allow a character to camp an objective in peace. Still not sure it'd be my first choice though. Then we have the Totem of Storms to make a Psyker a bit more reliable. It allows you to re-roll 1 psychic test or deny the witch roll once per round. Space Wolf Psykers are pretty good to be honest. That one seems perfectly reasonable to pick up on a librarian that's flying around casting spells. Could maybe save you a command re-roll or 2 throughout the course of the game. But probably the most interesting one is the Blacktooth Combat Knife, which genuinely turns the Phobos or Reaver Lieutenant into quite a nice melee machine. It replaces the combat knife or the paired combat blades, and it's got a fairly unassuming profile of strength +1, AP 0 and damage 1, and gives you +2 attacks rather than the standard +1. However, this thing can turn into an absolute ton of mortal wounds if you roll well, as each successful wound roll causes a mortal wound and the attack sequence ends. Now the Phobos and Reaver Lieutenants have 4 attacks base. This will give them an extra 2 for 6, then you'll have Shock Assault for an extra 1 to 7. So typically if you're fighting an enemy that's got toughness 4 or less, you'll usually get about 4 mortal wounds on them. That could be even better if you've got the Space Wolf's Combat Doctrine active for the exploding 6s to hit, or perhaps if you decide to combo it with the +2 attacks option from that Warlord trait. The Reaver Lieutenant should usually get it, so that will be 9 attacks, maybe with exploding 6s if you're lucky. It's not going to make them into a full-on smash character, but it should be really quite reliable at punching through things like characters with good imball saves. 4 or 5 mortal wounds per turn could easily run through an elite squad or kill a character to death for really quite a cheap investment. I'd say it's maybe the single most interesting thing out of this whole supplement. Finally, they've got a trio of helpful stratagems, as well as gaining access to the fairly powerful Space Wolves ones, which have options like putting a unit in Assault Doctrine early or +1 to wound. Firstly, we have Track and Hunt for 1 command point, which you use at the end of your movement phase, and it basically gives one of your core units ignores cover against one enemy unit for the entire rest of the turn, including in Assault. Sometimes that could be relevant if you're firing against an enemy unit that's got really tough saves in cover. It's not too bad to flex into ignores cover if you do really need it. The next one, and maybe the most powerful one in my opinion, is Killing Blow for 1 CP. Basically one of your core units gets +1 to wound, either in shooting or fighting, provided the target of that attack either has less than half of its models remaining, or if it's a single model unit that has less than half of its initial wounds remaining. Being able to turn on a +1 to wound in the shooting phase really is quite powerful, even if maybe it's not going to be relevant all the time as you need to use it on specific targets. It could also be a cheaper way of getting +1 to wound in the fight phase as well. The Space Wolf stratagem that they already get is 2 CP, and being able to turn that on for just 1 command point is significantly better. Maybe a touch situational, but I think there'll be quite a lot of times when that'll be really useful. Finally, for 1 command point is On the Scent. You select one unit that's taken damage with this turn, so presumably one that you've chipped a wound or 2 off in the shooting phase or the psychic phase, and then you can re-roll charge rolls against that unit with any of your core Wolfspear units. For me, I don't think that one's all that practical really. Probably only best if you've got one enormous enemy unit, and then you've got a whole ton of your core Wolfspear units that sort of need to make fairly long charges against it. If you've only got the one, I'd probably just go for the charge, and then you can always command re-roll it if you fail, and not waste the command point unless you need to. Overall, from this Codex supplement, I think the most interesting things are that Blacktooth Combat Knife, the Totem of Storms Relic, the Killing Blow +1 to wound stratagem, and the re-roll hits and extra AP Warlord Trait, which could be quite nice on a fighty character. To be honest, I think that some of the options are good, and it could give you an interesting different flavour of playing Space Wolves, though as normal with these Codex supplements, I'm not convinced it will see that much competitive play, compared with either taking the Space Wolf special characters, or doubling down on the damage dealing close combat traits, Whirlwind of Rage and Born Heroes. Overall though, I do think that these guys are interesting, could definitely give a different flavour of Space Wolves, and they might really not be all that far behind the competition. They certainly seem a lot more usable than some of the other White Dwarf Index rules that we've seen so far. I guess Stealthy could be pretty handy on Space Wolf Dreadnoughts for example, while the rest of the force moves up. So let me know what you think down in the comments. Might you be tempted to play the Wolfspear rules if you are playing Space Wolves yourselves? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k related content coming, with new videos out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.